right.
Okay. Yeah. So since you have don't have topics, I can go through this again. If anybody does have a topic they'd like to add, feel free to just put it in the chat on the agenda, and I'll wrap up. Let me figure out how I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, if I do it like this might work. And then see if that works. Yes. Okay. I think I've finally learned how to share on Google Meet now. It changed a little bit. All right. So I want to spend a little bit of time on the hopefully somewhat non-contentious parts of the doc. So last week we talked through the East-West Gateway implementation. I made some changes on export and capture, but we don't need to talk about that today. What I want to talk about now is the rest of the doc. So outside of the East-West Gateway, like export and capture user experience, do we have any other blockers or concerns with the rest of the doc?
One thing that wasn't super clear to me is what the actual WDS looks like. I know you went into a lot of detail, but so I'll mention the specific thing. It wasn't clear, like let's say I have two services that are, I don't know, multi-cluster services, and then I have two remote clusters they're in. Like how many WDS objects do I get? I know there's a WDS object for the gateway, but is there two, one for each gateway, or four, one for each gateway times each service, or more because there may be, I don't know.
So you said in the scenario, you said two services and two clusters?
Yeah, maybe three clusters, one local and then the two remote ones.
Okay, 3 clusters, 1 local and 2 remote. What does WDS look like? Great question. So, and I can definitely add some more information here. What I believe that would look like, is that you would have 3 different workloads, 1 local, 2 remote, and the 2 remote ones will be referenced from the services, because it's a service reference. The services reference the workloads.
No,
So,
the workloads reference the service.
Can you
so in XDS, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Dawson.
No, just to put this example, can you say that 2 remotes have each 2 endpoints? Because it's not clear if the 2 remotes are single. So let's put 2 remotes with 2 endpoints each.
2 endpoints each, okay.
So do you get 5 IPs or you get 3 IPs? That's a question, I think.
Yes, okay, got it. So yes, John is what I had it mixed up. So yeah, I see it here in my example. The workloads reference the service. So in the split horizon scenario that we're implementing, you would have the endpoints actually I think are irrelevant in this model. No, because we duplicate it. That's right. So we have a gateway. There's a gateway in each remote, and then there's 2 endpoints each. So in the WDS would be 2 gateways. So you'd have 4 different workloads, and they'd reference all the services they're a part of. So number of services is the constant, and from a size perspective, and then the gateway workloads that have the gateway IPs will just be duplicated times the number of endpoints they're fronting. So I think the answer is 4. 4 for the remotes, and then however many endpoints you have locally.
So basically 5 is the answer here, and 2
Should
of
be
them
1 local endpoint, yes.
Yeah, and 2 of them will be duplicated mostly. I mean, you will go to the same IP, it has the same character security and same handshake with the IP. You basically have make a connection to the gateway in each cluster, but you still send 2 entries because you want to track individual. So if you have 100 endpoints in that cluster, you will send 100 mostly duplicated, because as a client, you still connect just to one IP as a gateway.
I believe that is correct. Yes, that's what we do today in for sidecars is the whole split horizon duplication.
We do both, depending on how you set it up. I mean, if you set it up with the previous East-West gateway, you got only the IP of the gateway and the weight that was calculated, but it's not necessarily that because you don't care. I mean, they can be duplicated IPs. The IP is no longer relevant if you go to gateway. Keep in mind that IP overlap is supported today. So you can have the same IP 10.1.1.1 in each cluster. And it's not really primary. You cannot distinguish the IP in cluster 1 and cluster 2 because they have the same IP address. It's a combination of gateway plus IP that is, or network plus IP that is unique.
Yes, the network plus IP is unique. I don't know if you're specifically talking about like Envoy cluster or Kubernetes cluster, but I think I agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, maybe we should keep it as, both options should be possible depending on topology, because in some cases, if you have flat network and connectivity and you can do L4 without going through a gateway, it may make sense. Sure. But in most cases, it doesn't scale. I mean, there is no point in sending 1,000 endpoints if you cannot reach them directly.
So let me clarify that a little bit. So for this doc is specifically the multi-network use case. For flat network, there are other considerations. Things get a bit simpler when it comes to addressing and what the control plane has to know. You don't need to do this coalescing, for example. But to your point, there are some scale concerns because even though we're not sending, there's less churn because we're not sending the raw remote endpoints. We're sending like we're sending the gateway IP. I do feel like there are some scale concerns, and I've got a comment that has one, or I've got a section of the doc that has one upvote, one downvote. Where we talk about actually that one is talking about network load balancing, so ignore me. But yeah, at some point, I in this iteration of the doc, I talked about adding some weighting into WDS to help prevent that scale issue. So where Istio D reads all the remote endpoints, but just does the calculation on the control plane side and tells the Z tunnel what weight goes to which, rather than having to send the raw workloads.
So would it make sense to do that instead of sending the 2 endpoints for each? I mean, you have 1,000 endpoints, to not send that 1,000 because they're not useful, to send the weight 1,000 and gateway IP. Especially if there is churn and if they keep changing, and I mean, I don't know if we are still doing on demand, but it's going to be a lot of wasted traffic since you don't get to use them in any way unless they are stateful sets.
Yeah, I wouldn't be opposed to waiting at all. I think that probably it's probably simple because there are a lot of moving parts here. It's probably going to be from an implementation perspective, implementing what we have a split horizon first is going to be the most straightforward for today, because it's just less concerns about designing the API, et cetera. And it gives us a benchmark for scale. But then, like for beta scope, for example, I definitely think we should look into another alternative option for expressing the weighting, besides just duplicating the endpoints. Okay. Does it send 1,000 endpoints? No, costing you. I think you're right. I think we do send you a single endpoint, and then we use Envoy's weighted cluster to be able to send. That's a good call out. You're correct there.
No, it does, because if you have, say, I have one remote, I have 2 services. That gateway ends up in both cluster load assignments. So it's one per service.
But not 1,000. You have 1,000 endpoint in cluster 2. You don't send 1,000 endpoints.
Oh yeah, but not here either, right?
Yeah. So that's 1,000 probably. Maybe I misspoke and I said two endpoints each, 1,000 each basically was probably the correct example.
Like
Yeah,
the,
okay,
the
so we're on
count
the same
is the
page.
number of services times the number of remote clusters.
Yes, but not
okay.
not all number of endpoints.
Right, not related to pods.
Okay, so let's put it in the document kit. I mean, I think we are pretty much on the same page. It's
I may have missed that last part. With the current model, when we're coalescing, it's still one per. We still have to send the gateway workload multiple times, right? If we've got 2 endpoints for the service, we need to send 2 workloads so that zTunnel does the load balancing appropriately.
but that's a change versus how it works today, because today we just send one endpoint with a weight of 2.
Yes, that is a departure. That is a change. So yeah, I think we might need to do weighting initially.
I think so. It will be a pretty significant regression to. I mean, if you have a very large service, which is kind of the main use case for multi-cluster,
Yep.
it's kind of unfortunate to. And it doesn't sound more difficult than.
Yep, I think I agree. John, you and I talked a little bit. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, we're saying we're add weight to the workload, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. To me, it sounds fine. Louis in the past has mentioned he has strong opinions on how weight should work, even just in general, and I didn't fully understand them. So it's worth just thinking it up with him to understand what. Like, I think he wanted the concept of weight, but not weight as an integer that means what it does. I didn't really understand why though. So.
I have a comment on this subject because weight is it's not specific to multi-cluster. I mean, you can have in a single cluster, you can have 8 CPU, pod, and then another deployment with 2 CPU nodes. And that will also, and you also, advanced Istio may take into account the current load. So you have one that is overloaded and one that is idle. So it's useful to, if you add weight, to consider it as a kind of a general feature of WDS, not specific to, and not necessarily static. As a general
I was taking notes, so I missed that. To be completely honest, can you briefly repeat that? I'm sorry.
So weight is not specific to multi-cluster. It also applies to single cluster where you have, let's say, 2 deployments, one with 8 CPUs and one with 2 CPUs. So we want to convey the fact that this endpoint has 8 CPUs and this endpoint has 2 CPUs as weights in single cluster if we choose to. And it's not necessarily that it's a requirement. I mean, we can live without it because most of the times they are equal. I mean, you create a deployment with 8 CPU switch, but it's useful to have it in single cluster and normal use case as a concept.
Yeah, I completely agree. We just want to make sure. I think the point you're driving towards there, Kostin, is that it needs to be consistent between the single cluster use case as well as the multi-cluster use case, and I completely agree with that. I think one interesting question I have here is, we don't have to tackle this now, but TCP route is a thing, and this is starting to get close to maybe some TCP route-ish type of things. Do we want to explicitly call that out as out of scope for this field? Do we want to make sure this field can work for it? How do we feel about TCP route and zTunnel and what this means for potential support down the line there?
Just one note on weight before we move on. I agree that it should be the same in single cluster and whatnot, but just FYI, we don't have an API today to say the weight of a pod only on workload entry. So if we added that and we add weight into zTunnel, obviously we would plummet through there, but we don't get that just by adding it into zTunnel.
Agreed.
Yeah.
You mean we need to change the proto definition to include the weight, and then we need to have some way to populate it. And for weight,
yeah, I just mean like today, like on Envoy, there's no way to do weight for a pod. You can only do it for a workload entry.
Oh.
So we can add those two. They're kind of separate, but I just didn't want to make it seem like Kostin, like if we just add this weight stuff to ambient, it still won't solve your specific use case there. Because we don't have-
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I mean, zTunnel doesn't have the same limitation. With zTunnel, you can do whatever you want. You can.
No, it's not a data plane limitation. It's a control plane limitation. There's just no API
Yeah.
for a user to tell us that today.
Oh, I see what you're saying, but that's not, I mean, they do have a way, it's port spec, they specify the number of CPUs, so we can, it doesn't have to, don't have to duplicate the configuration. That's why it gives the example with 8 CPUs. I mean, it's kind of-
Yeah.
What?
Well, okay. They may have an API, but we haven't codified the mapping of API
Of course.
weight in these.
Of course,
Yes.
of course.
That's all. Yeah.
But, we have plenty of APIs. I think most users just want it to work and they deploy it. I mean, we can look at CPUs as a default. If anyone asks ever to change it. Anyway.
So that's where I started thinking about like TCP route, for example, which is I know service versus pod, but as a scoping note, are we? I know we've agreed to design the API to where it can be used for multiple different use cases. Do we want to keep in mind, like, does it make sense, for example, to like adopt the? Granted, we need to talk to Louis a bit about this because John T has strong opinions. But do we want to adopt the TCP route idea of weight? Because there are different ways, semantics around weight, for example. Does it need to be consistent whenever together we convert them?
Those are totally different. They both have weight in the name, but they're unrelated. One is about distributing across distinct services, while one is a load balancing algorithm within one service.
Yes. Should I both have routing in them and they have completely different meanings? I mean, L4 routing and L7 routing are very, very different beasts, and it's better to never mix them again, like we did. That's kind of the main benefit of a gateway API is that it has a distinct HTTP route and TCP route, and that probably the implementation need to be distinct as well because we restored the order in networking.
Well, sure, but like to John's point there, within gateway routes the route weighting is somewhat consistent semantically because it's distributing between two different services. This is load balancing within a single service. So my takeaway is not shackled. They're actually sort of orthogonal things, even though they say the word have the same word weight in them. Routing between two services versus load balancing within a service are relevant. Okay, are orthogonal rather than irrelevant. Okay, sounds good. I've taken that down. Appreciate the feedback on this. I'm glad we talked about it because we made a decision on to change some things on weighting. Is there anything else as far as the control plane implementation? As a reminder, there are a couple of PRs out for the Echo Server implementation. Jackie's got a PR out for the service host name, having zTunnel respect service host names, and then Steven's got like a draft PR out for actual zTunnel double H-bone client that relies on the control plane implementation. So there's some stuff to take a look at today. If we make the weighting change, and then we can discuss the East-West Gateway piece a little bit later. But if we make those changes, is everybody fine? Are we sort of in agreement with the rest of the doc?
I'll double check through it just because I had some comments a while ago, but they were mostly just comments of the lines of I agree with everything except for these lines. So I think it should be good.
Can I ask you a question? In the past, with the previous implementation, we had these properties that someone could just take a single cluster Istio, use some external controller, whatever, by hand, create waypoint entries, waypoint groups, and have equivalent, not automatic, but equivalent and self-actuated and manual. Is it still possible to do it today? I mean, if you can create workload entries with some labels, with some, can you recreate the same behavior?
That is a good question. some of the gateway stuff might be a little tricky. I don't know what we do today for multi-network with
There's some
gateway.
labels. There are some hidden labels that I mean, undocumented or not well documented labels that if you put in the right place, I mean, you create a gateway, you put a label, network label, and then
That's
the
right, network
network
label.
is already taking care of, treating it as a. Anyway, it will be worth making sure that we can test everything because the benefit was that it gave people ability to do fine-grained and have take control basically and implement their own policies about things that, I mean, maybe they don't want, the ease of everything works by default, but they want to have the control where, I send only traffic in Europe and I have this kind of weird situations. And it's while everything working easily, it's nice. Having control is also very useful in some cases.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I do believe all those properties are retained. We're using all the same WDS. Aside from the weighting stuff, is going to be a bit different depending on the API we use to expose it. But we can keep that in mind when designing that API. But the rest of it is mainly just being able to parse service host name and how we communicate to the gateways and how Ztone does load balancing, which are all control plane bits. So yeah, nothing here makes me think that we wouldn't be able to implement it with workload entry and service entry, workload group, etc. But to your point, it should be something that we try to do and test. We have a good suite of tests already for things. So that's a good call out. I'll add a comment here to try to make sure we preserve that property.
In terms of APIs, that's the reason workload entry has the weight is because it was used for this purpose.
Ah, I see. Okay. That's probably a good place to look for prior art, actually. Okay, I'll pause here to check the agenda. I still don't see any topics. Don't see any new topics here. If no one has anything else, we can talk about East-West Gateway things, but want to give folks a chance to preempt the agenda if they've got something else that they want to discuss. Going once, going twice. All right, you all know me. I'm happy to keep talking for a very long time, so we can keep going then. So the big after last discussion and some of all the great points that you folks made on the export API for the multi-network, went through and changed this and integrated some the information from another doc I had been working on sort of in the background on service capture and exporting. I also started a discussion in Slack around labels versus routes for this API. I think where I've landed, given that, given the end of that discussion, and a point specifically the point Mike made around gateway attached HTTP routes versus a service attached HTTP route, and those interacting strangely, I think a label is the best place to start, and that this API will give users a lot of flexibility. So let me sort of briefly describe what this is. So. Today in Mesh Config, we already have a service settings field. And what we would do is we would augment that, so we have enhanced functionality that exists there today. Basically allows you to say like cluster.local is local or global. Well, what we would do is there's like one bool field or something like that that's there today. What we would do is we'd add more flexibility. So we'd have here's a better example. The proto stuff's not super useful, but I'll zoom in a bit. What we would do is we would have a service scopes field that is a list, and there are sort of two components here. There's a server-side component, multi-cluster, and a client-side component. So in a local cluster that's exposing its services to the mesh globally, what the mesh admin does is they come to this service scopes field and they say, they create a match expression for namespaces and services. Maybe if they don't want services to have a matrix to be able to opt individually, it has to be namespace level, for example, they'd be able to offer that with a particular match expression. But let's take namespace as an example. Let's say, hey, if you've got a Istio, and this is actually incorrect, I didn't copy this here, but on the namespace side, you would say, if you've got a label with key istio.o/label, and this should actually, instead of exists, should be equals true, then that will be considered to be in this service scope, which would be global. API is not great. We'd actually want to probably move this out. And I'm on my wrong account, so it's making these suggestions. Apologies for the weirdness. But basically, so global, yada yada, and then it would be like true, and then this scope probably should come out of a DNS config. Well, writing in here is difficult. Scope global. Yeah. And then, John, I don't know where your comments just went. So apologies if I broke something.
No, I deleted them myself. I realized they were wrong. So.
Okay. But yeah, so service scopes, this is on the server side. If you have this expression matching to true, you'll be in this scope, which in this case is global. And then same thing for this for the services. And then on the client side, we'll say that there's a DNS config of some sort. And so if you have a suffix of start a cluster.local, it'll be set to a regex. Not a pure regex, but like specifically a DNS host name. Then you'll also be a part of, then all your requests will go to that scope. So if I'm on the client side and I send a request to cluster.local, that will be resolved with the global scope. But if I wanted to, as a default, as a mesh admin, say no traffic goes locally, or sorry, no traffic goes globally by default, then you'll say that you could have a service scope with a DNS config and it would have scope local. Even talking through it to somebody for the first time, realizing there's probably some rough edges you want to massage out here as an API. But how do we feel about this direction for a export and capture API? Export being server side, capture being client side.
I mean, I just had a conversation a few days ago with someone about this similar topic, and it's something we did it many times in the past. I mean, with session affinity, for example, that's how we started. With a lot of other things, that's what we have. And it's viable. It's a good hack. It's a good short-term solution, but it ain't an API. So that's, again, we can get feedback from users. We can see how it works. We can do a lot of things. But in terms of API, it's something that, it has a CRD, it has autocomplete, it has all the properties, validation, ARP security, and all other properties. I'm not saying we should not do this. It's a great start. And that's a pattern we followed many, many times in the past of adding something in mesh config and enabling the feature so it can be tested. But in all cases, it graduated, or it's supposed to graduate to a proper API, either in the mainstream or in Istio. And given that HTTP route and a lot of other things already exist, we may not need another API to be invented. We can just use the APIs that already existed. The only thing I want to make sure is that a user who is not an Istio user, is not using Istio-D, could express the same thing through the gateway APIs or to some proper APIs that have RBAC control and other things, or there is a path to this case. Other than that, from our experience with different things that try to do the same thing, keep in mind supportability and maintainability for users, because every time we had this flexibility of allowing arbitrary labels, it become very difficult for people to, because someone will decide to use a label foo, the others will use a label bar, and accidents can happen. And it's very, very difficult for someone who's maintaining Istio to figure out what each, I mean, if you think of large organizations, it's very difficult for the people who maintain the mesh to figure out, to coordinate and to do this kind of stuff. Maybe sometimes having a fixed label like we did with Session Affinity, it may be more maintainable, but both of them are fine. I mean, as short term, just don't treat it as an API. As long as you don't say this is an API, it's just, some labels that we support that allow people to enable the feature. That's different from an API that has guarantee of stability, since there is no stability anyway, because you can change the label however you want. You cannot guarantee that we have infinite support for putting the label foo. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think I generally agree with that. I mean, I think that as a project, we can't support whatever labeling scheme that a company comes up with. If they pick a bad labeling scheme, and they pick a bad labeling scheme, that's not necessarily that's not on us. And with respect to Gateway API and future APIs, I certainly would love to collaborate with Gateway API in order to be able to figure out how to express the multi-cluster story a bit better. For clarity, Gateway API today, the only multi-cluster experience that they really support is MCS. And so short of MCS, I was there when the GEP was written, unless I missed something. MCS is the only multi-cluster thing you're going to find on the Gateway API set of gaps.
I kind of disagree with that. I think Gateway API by definition is multi-cluster API in terms of defining export. We keep using words that confuse ourselves with the words that we are using. There is nothing special about southwest or east-west or north-south or whatever. It's a gateway. We are reading about gateways, and exporting a service outside of a cluster boundary is what the Gateway API is doing. There is no distinction between internet, exposing it to internet, or exposing it to another cluster. Both of them are exposing some service that is internal to an external cluster. So I don't think, I cannot understand any difference between the two cases, basically. What we are missing and what is missing and what is broken in MCS is basically ability for a client to indicate that, hey, I want to use cluster local to mean local or global. And that's understood, that's clear. However, for non-cluster local use cases, again, there is no confusion it was never a confusion between.
Okay. Yeah, I think I agree with that. From the export case specifically, right? You just have a gateway. If you're not using Istio, it's just adding route to the gateway, and I don't think anything here necessarily precludes that. It's just a gateway. This is more of an Istiofy API, and if somebody wants to make a gateway API centric experience, like a pure gateway API experience from that, they have the ability to do so. Like you said, the main thing that this proposal adds over Gateway API is, or not over, but in addition to Gateway API, is the client side piece of being able to say what scope different DNS suffixes are going to resolve to.
That's what I have a problem with, because I know Louis is very strongly for supporting the case where cluster local is kind of differentiated, and you can specify cluster local is local or cluster local is global. And for cluster local, I don't have any concern. You can put whatever you want. I don't think it's something that people should do in the first place. But if you have a service like example.com or google.com or any other name, the standards that are prevalent on the internet kind of, they are global names. Except for .internal, everything else is by definition FUDN that is globally available, globally visible, and it has semantics of multi-cluster. If you go to google.com, is never a local service.
Sure.
So
yeah.
The defaults, if you use any other domain except .internal or .local, defaulting to global, I think is a very reasonable approach, and it's exactly what clients do with the Gateway API as it is.
Yeah, big +1. I'm also in favor of defaulting to global here. And then if there's an admin who wants just a different default for their cluster, they're able to set that with this configuration.
Yep. And .internal is a special one, which usually means, keep it inside the organization with multi-cluster. So we have .internal, .local, and anything else. And if you want to find
if you just want to use service
whatever.
entry, that they can use whatever host name scheme, DNS scheme that they want, figure kube DNS, whatever. This will allow them to do that. Okay, awesome. John, I know you and I talked about this API a decent bit, and you were working on some comments. Anything you want to add here?
I'm mostly good with it. I just need to think a bit more about the DNS config.
Yeah, same.
The other fields I think make sense.
Yeah, DNS config and like how it interacts with the scope in particular is what I need to think about that a little bit more. But yeah, I think we're in agreement on the selection. Go ahead, Costin.
And take a look at external DNS, which is probably the largest project today in Kubernetes that is programming DNS and works very well.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll do.
And they have their own label. That's why I mentioned it. I mean, they have their own label and they have their own API, and it's it's decent.
All right, appreciate the heads up. I'll take a look there. Going on the horn, I guess Lynn or anybody else on the call have any thoughts on this API?
So I need to come up to speed on this. I'll do it offline.
Yeah, no problem. Feel free to send me a message anytime. Okay then. I think that's everything from me. It sounds like, and please correct me if I'm misrepresenting things. Lynn needs to review the proposal, the API specifically. But other than that, it doesn't seem like there's any large disagreement on the direction of anything here. If after I factor in the changes to the to the workload weight. Okay, I'll get these worked in in time for Wednesday's working group meeting, and I'll follow up with folks offline if they have questions. Would love to have folks feel comfortable enough to approve fairly soon. So I appreciate the time, everyone. No other topics, so I guess we're done. Bye, folks.
Yep, bye.